Does the Bible support the abuse of women? The Bible is a sacred text for billions of people around the world, and its teachings have been interpreted in many different ways over time. Some people argue that certain passages in the Bible have been used to justify harmful practices, including the abuse of women, while others assert that the Bible, when interpreted correctly, promotes respect, love, and equality for all people, including women. The argument that the Bible supports the abuse of women. Some people point to certain passages in the Bible that they believe justify the mistreatment of women. These passages, when taken literally or out of context, may seem to imply that women are inferior to men or that their roles in society are restricted. For example, the creation story. In Genesis at 2:18 to 24, the Bible describes the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. Some interpret this to mean that women were created as subordinate to men, suggesting an inherent inequality. In particular, Genesis 3:16, in which God tells Eve that her desire will be for her husband and that he will rule over her, is often cited to justify patriarchal relationships. The Apostle Paul's letters. Many of Paul's writings are viewed as reinforcing gender inequality. For example, in 1 Timothy 2:11 to 15, Paul states that women should learn in silence and submission and should not teach or have authority over men. In Ephesians 5:22 to 24, Paul writes that wives should submit to their husbands as the church submits to Christ, a passage often used to promote hierarchical relationships in marriage where the husband holds authority over the wife. The treatment of women in ancient society. The Bible often reflects the cultural norms of the time in which it was written, and women in ancient Israelite and early Christian societies had limited rights compared to men. For instance, in the Old Testament, women are often treated as property or as secondary to male figures, with few legal protections or personal rights. In some instances, women were required to marry their assaulters, Deuteronomy 22:28 through 29, which has been viewed by some as condoning the abuse of women. The silence of women. There are passages in the Bible that seem to suggest that women should remain silent or not speak in church settings. 1 Corinthians 14:34 to 35 states, "Let your women keep silent in the churches," which some interpret as supporting the marginalization of women in spiritual and religious life. Old Testament laws. Women as property and punitive measures. Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Several laws in the Old Testament reflect a society in which women had little autonomy and were often treated as property. For example, Leviticus 12 prescribes a purification ritual for women after childbirth, which some interpret as suggesting that women are ritually unclean and inferior to men who are not subject to the same restrictions. Deuteronomy 22:28 to 29 states that if a man assaults a woman who is not betrothed, the man must marry her and pay her father 50 shekels of silver. While this law may have been intended to protect women by ensuring they are not left without economic or social support, it has been viewed as reducing a woman's worth to her sexual purity and casting her as a property to be owned by a man after such an event. Critics argue that such laws may have enabled a system where women were treated as second-class citizens and even as objects of exchange or ownership. Additionally, in Deuteronomy 21:10 through 14, the law regarding women captured during war instructs that a soldier may take a woman as his wife, but must allow her a period of mourning before consummating the marriage. While some may view this as a concession to the woman's emotional needs, others argue that this is a law that enables sexual violence and coerces women into marriage without their consent. Counter-arguments. The Bible's call for equality and respect for women. However, many scholars, theologians, and religious leaders argue that these passages are misinterpreted or taken out of context and do not, in fact, support the abuse of women. There are several key points to consider. Jesus' treatment of women. Jesus Christ, who is the central figure in Christianity, demonstrated compassion and respect for women. He challenged cultural norms by engaging with women publicly, such as speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, John 4, healing women, e.g. the woman with the issue of blood in Mark 5, and defending women from punishment, such as the woman accused of adultery in John 8. Jesus' treatment of women stands in contrast to the practices of his time, which often excluded or oppressed women. The example of women in the Bible. There are numerous women in the Bible who hold leadership roles or are shown to have deep spiritual significance. Deborah was a judge and leader in Israel, Judges 4-5, while Esther saved the Jewish people from genocide, Book of Esther. Phoebe was a deacon in the early church, Romans 16:1, and Priscilla was a teacher and leader in the early Christian community, Acts 18. These examples suggest that women were seen as valuable leaders and contributors to society. Galatians 3:28, equality in Christ. A passage often cited in support of gender equality is Galatians 3:28, where Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." This verse emphasizes the spiritual equality of all believers, regardless of gender or social status, and has been used by many to argue that the Bible supports equality for women. Contextual interpretation. Many theologians argue that passages which seem to subordinate women need to be understood in their historical and cultural context. For example, the Apostle Paul's letters were often addressing specific issues in the early church and were not intended to provide a universal, timeless directive on the role of women. In the context of the first-century Mediterranean world, where women were often marginalized, Paul's advice may have been a means of promoting peace and order rather than a prescription for eternal gender roles.